Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Steinberg Drum Machine mini-series. Today we're going to have a look at editing instrument and sample sounds. Basically, we're going to figure out what all of these controls in the primary interface of the instrument tab, what they all do. I've loaded the down tempo movement preset. That's what we're going to be playing with today. So this is right out of the box. And we're going to start off by playing on the D1 pad, the snare. And just before we make a start, one thing to note is that many of the sounds in the drum machine are, in my opinion, too velocity sensitive. If you click a pad, it outputs the volume at MIDI 127, in other words, as loud as the sound can be. But if I play the corresponding key on the keyboard, at anywhere near a reasonable level, it's too quiet for my liking. This is the velocity sensitivity control, velocity into level. I'm going to turn that down so that for today's purposes, I don't have to hit the key quite so hard. Okay, so what are we dealing with here? Well, we're dealing with primarily an instrument sound. On layers 2 and 3, we've got a little bit of additional colour that's being added to the sound. If we mute the snare, you can hear a transient and noise just poking through. And it's just worth pointing out actually that I've changed the velocity sensitivity for layer 1, but not for layers 2 and 3. So let's just pull them down as well, so they're all mixed properly. And there are the transient and noise samples. Just going to ignore them for now and concentrate on the instrument. The sound that you're hearing here is snare number 4, and this is an FM-based kit piece. Really important to bear in mind that in each of these categories, we're dealing with the snare category here, each of these kit pieces is quite radically different. Snares 1 and 2 are relatively straightforward and they have a much more simplified set of controls. Snare 3 has a feature where we can introduce a glitch, which is basically like a noise pop at the beginning of the sound. But Snare 4, which is the kit piece that this particular preset uses, has some FM controls. So let's just kind of wrap all of that up and figure out what's going on here. These internal instrument sounds are digitally generated. They're not fundamentally based on samples. The entire thing is synthesized. And that means that you're dealing with oscillators, filters, envelopes, and all of the controls in the bottom display represent that fact. This is why we have a set of 4 FM controls. Let's have a look at these FM controls in the oscillator, because thinking about this stuff is going to help you understand how the drum machine works and what it is you're really doing with all of these controls. Fundamentally, what's going on with these sounds is that each of them has 2 oscillators, and for the most part you don't even notice that there are actually 2 oscillators. When we're playing with Snare 4, those 2 oscillators are used in a modulator and carrier relationship. This is what generates FM. We're not going to go into discussing all of the principles of FM today, but fundamentally it uses one of its 2 oscillators to modulate the pitch of the other, and that enables us to have quite digital, kind of 80s processed sounds. Now if I increase the FM level quite dramatically, there you can hear that FM sound really kicking in. As we mess with the various FM controls now, that's a really wide range of sounds we've just dialed up almost instantly by using these 2 oscillators in an FM relationship. If we have a look at one of the other snare pieces, let's have a look at number 1. We don't see any of that complexity, so you can't directly access the FM module, but you do still have 2 oscillators. Have a look at this mysteriously titled ratio control down at the bottom. When I first came across the drum machine and I was trying to figure out what this control does, you go away to the manual, and this is just absolutely classic Steinberg. So here are the 4 label descriptions for the controls in Snare 1 oscillator. So it allows you to adjust the level of the oscillator. Awesome, brilliant. Okay. Tone allows you to adjust the waveform. Yep. Tune for tuning. Okay. And then ratio allows you to adjust the interval between the 2 oscillators. Excuse me. The 2 oscillators. The oscillator, the oscillator, the oscillator, the 2 oscillators. No explanation at all in that section. that you're dealing with two oscillators, but of course we subsequently figure out we are. When we go on to have a look at the FM engine, it becomes much more obvious. And as it happens, this ratio control allows us some level of control between the two pitches of those oscillators. So that's them synced up. And there you can hear oscillator 2 going up in pitch. Let's turn the noise module all the way down so that we're not being polluted by the noise. Now you can hear quite clearly two different oscillators making sound. Over on snare number 3, we have this module called glitch, and this basically allows us, I'm presuming that we use one of the two oscillators for this purpose, but we introduce a noise element. Once again, let's turn the actual noise module all the way down and glitch all the way down as well. There's my oscillator. Now introduce some glitch. Now we've got a pop at the beginning of the sound, and I think it's probably oscillator 2 that's being used for that purpose. So because we have an entirely generative model, we've got all this flexibility to implement different types of synthesis models on the sound design, and as you've heard, you can have some pretty artificial effects, which might be exactly what you're looking for. Nothing intrinsically wrong with artificial. I made a right mess of that sound. I'll just quickly reload my preset, and I'll solo snare 4 so the other stuff isn't getting in the way. Next along we have a noise module. Noise is very often used in percussion sounds, so it's perfectly reasonable to have its own section. Noise is a really integral part of snare. That's going to be, if you're using a synthesized model, how are you going to generate a lot of the snare rattle. The rest of the controls in the noise module are relatively straightforward. It's all about controlling the stereo width and tonal color. White noise is all of the frequencies, pink noise throws away some of the higher frequencies. Next along we have a pitch modulator. Now without envelope depth, none of this is going to do anything because this is modulating the pitch dynamically over time as opposed to a static pitch control that we accomplish with our tune knob. So if we have plenty of envelope depth, you can hear me adjusting both the length of the envelope with the decay control and how much of that comes in with the envelope depth. The punch control modifies the envelope shape. So with maximum punch, you're basically generating a logarithmic curve, which means it's going to start off very steep and then shallow out. You're going to get a much more dramatic effect. As opposed to turn that down, we're going to have a linear envelope, which has a more gentle slope. We saw the amplifier envelope section right at the beginning of the video when I turned down the velocity sensitivity, but this basically determines how long the sound is going to last. And we have this strange control called accent. Accent is fairly hilarious in the manual. This is what the manual has to say. Specifies the sound based on increasing velocities. Has that been written by somebody who knows what this control does? Because specifies the sound. Yeah, what it actually does is specifies different aspects of the frequency curve. It seems to me to be like a bandpass filter where you're accentuating a particular set of frequencies. If I turn up accent, it's just a much more dramatic and emphasized sound without me being able to pinpoint exactly what's going on, and I imagine the person who wrote the manual had a similar feeling. I'm not really sure what's going on here, so I'll say you're affecting the sound. Poor manual authors getting wailed on today, isn't it? Right, I won't criticise them again. Now, the distortion control is really straightforward. You can see actually in the waveform viewer for the sample, basically just square wave central. The wave is being absolutely crushed to death. And it's quite a nice visual way actually of controlling the moment when distortion first begins to happen. You can actually visually see when it starts to clip. Offset varies the difference between odd harmonics if the control's turned all the way to the left, and even harmonics if it's turned all the way up. Even harmonics have a tendency to cancel each other out, which is why the sound gets thinner and thinner. And finally, the amplifier section is obviously going to be all about the overall level. We're not going to deal with effects today because I'll reserve that for the next episode. But this FX control here determines how much of the sound is sent to the internal FX bus. We have an overall brightness control, which is called tone in the amplifier section, but color in the oscillator section. Why those two things have been called different names, they're both effectively brightness controls, I'm not altogether sure. And so having had that sweep through the various snare kit pieces, we can jump over to one of the other kit pieces and we're going to see a very similar story. Most of the controls that we've just discussed are in all of the kit pieces and you're going to see subtle differences. So here's one of the tom sounds, for instance. It has a glitch control. Let's have a look at a different tom control. This one has high pass and low pass filters set on the noise module, and here they are. Now let's have a chat about the other type of sound that we can make, which is sample-based sounds. I'm going to use the cymbal pad to talk about this today. This cymbal pad is once again made up of 3 layers, which I'm immediately going to pare down to 1 for simplicity's sake. It's a bit quiet actually, I'll just turn it up. There we go. And as you can see in the sample viewer, we have a very different world view. Now for every single sample sound, you're going to get exactly the same controls. There's extra stuff, however, in this upper part of the viewer because we can control the sample start position, its end position, fade in and fade out. Now we can manually access the fade in and fade outs from these numerical controls. They're in milliseconds, but if you go up to the top of the sample, you can control the fade in from there as well. We can reverse the entire sample. And we can see where it lives as well. If you hover over this eye and it says factory audio file, it means it's an internal Steinberg sample. If it's something that you've loaded in, you'd be able to see the path. One important difference between sample sounds and instrument sounds is that samples can be individually altered. So I can overwrite sample 1 in layer 1 and leave the other 2 layers alone. I'll give you a quick demo of that. In my media rack, I've dialed up a cymbal sound here, which, because I have preview currently engaged, is currently playing. But what I'm going to do is pick that sample up and I'm going to drag it across and drop it on the individual layer. See, as I'm hovering around, most of the time you get your little red cross, but as you hover over each of the layers, you have the option to drop it directly on there. If, however, I picked that sample up and dragged it straight onto the pad, this would basically blank layers 2 and 3. I'll do it, and there you go. So that's basically overwritten the entire pad as opposed to one of the individual layers. You don't have any of that with instruments. In fact, when you drag an instrument across, I'll just do it very quickly, you don't even have the option to drop it on a layer. You can only drop it on a pad. Okay, so I've just dropped this new sample into layer 1, and there it is. An additional option that becomes available to you in sample mode is your gate options. See this little symbol here, it says gate mode on or off. It's currently off, which basically means there is no gate. The amplifier is in total control of how long this sample will play for, and it's actually going to use a combination of this control called one-shot mode and the hold knob. Now hold is currently set quite high at the moment. I'm going to turn both hold and decay down so that you can hear much more clearly what's happening here. I'm going to hit the pad very quickly. So you heard a period of time over which the sample carried on playing after I'd made my quick mouse click. If I increase the hold control, this is basically a static period of time at which the sample will be played back at maximum volume. And then it begins to decay. And the combination of hold plus decay determine how long you hear that sample for. In addition, you can also engage one-shot mode. When we turn that on, everything else disappears because the entire sample plays regardless of how long it is. I just literally made a very small mouse click. The entire thing is played back at full volume. So there's a fairly complex interrelationship between one-shot mode and gate mode. You basically need to figure out what each of those do. So at the moment, the amplifier is in total control of the playback of the sample. Now I'm going to engage gate mode. This now means I have some manual interaction. The amplifier still has something to say. The decay knob is still very important. But if I turn the decay knob down quite a bit, I'm going to click the pad and then hold it down, then let go, and then it stops almost immediately. I'll reintroduce some decay, which is effectively release. It's a strange name for a control. Ordinarily, once you've stopped doing a thing, it's typically called the release cycle. That's really what's going on with this envelope decay. So click, release, fade. Hold the mouse down for longer. Now release, and then it fades away gently. So I'm now in control by how long I hold that key down for basically playing the sample back at full volume, and when I let it go, the amplifier once again has something to say. But we're still not done because we have a curved or linear decay option. If I engage that, increase the decay. So this is linear mode. The sample fades away very consistently. Disengage linear mode. We're now in curved mode. You can see the curved symbol. It fades away more quickly, but then carries on for more or less the same amount of time. That's quite a complex suite of amplifier options. It's very nice. Sometimes complexity is a good thing if it's implemented very well. This is good. It has a lot of controls in it, but it's very, very powerful. Now let's kind of work backwards to have a look at the controls that we haven't yet seen. Let's do pitch next. Relatively straightforward if the envelope depth is at 0, because most of the other controls are determining what's going to happen with a pitch variance over time. Our primary tuning control does a pretty obvious job, but as soon as we introduce an envelope, now I have attack and decay values that I can implement. And I've got all sorts of crazy stuff that I can get up to. So this is modulating pitch over time. I can also make that pitch modulation velocity sensitive. Quiet key, harder key, different pitch variants. Turn my envelope back off again, and all of these controls are effectively shut down. We have a pre-filter where we can arbitrarily throw away sections of the upper or lower frequencies. Then we have our finer granularity in the main filter section. So we're on a low pass filter here. Obviously, we've got all sorts of different filter choices to go at. But if I introduce a filter envelope, and I'll increase the hold so that we get the main body of the sound, and then the filter kicks in. Let's introduce some attack. So we're going up and then back down again. There we go. Lots of fun to be had with filter envelopes on drum sounds for all your spacey sci-fi effects. So that's a pretty hefty set of tone filtering controls. Even though I've been critical of the manual and there are some really clunky elements to the interface, for the most parts it is actually a very powerful engine. I personally much prefer the clarity of the sample-based side of things, and as I intimated in my last episode, I'm largely going to be using the drum machine in sample mode. But the instruments are interesting. They do have quite a character to them with their dual oscillator setup, And the ability to introduce FM, it's a thing that's worth investigating, so I'm certainly not going to write them off. It's just that there are a few aspects of the implementation that I'm not particularly impressed with right out of the gate. Anyway, that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Helps me out with YouTube. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.